Hello all. Going to be doing a weapons video this evening. Still trying to get a little bit more help with respect to demonstration videos, but in the meantime, we can discuss some valuable issues and trainings that we can do solo. When we talk about the relationship between combat and human evolution, it gets complicated when we talk about agricultural aspects, because certainly when you're slaughtering animals, there's an obvious relationship between what one has to do and understand in terms of anatomy and things of that nature and a bladed weapon. But in our earliest times, in terms of agriculture and weapons and farm implements, there's often a crossover where the use of an implement becomes weaponized in military applications, and it makes perfect sense. There's also a sort of a backwards aspect and a reverse engineering process that often is really bad. And that's where we take and we try to make things look very dangerous and things of that nature, when in fact we don't have to. What we have to do is we have to understand what makes something an excellent weapon in the first place, okay? And there are even a few of these things that kind of sneak in the cracks here. With that being said, this is the Japanese Hori Hori knife. It is a gardening knife, okay? However, if you understand what you're doing, this probably is one of the most lethal weapons, lethal type of bladed weapons that one can have access to. And again, it's not considered to be particularly dangerous because people don't know any better. So, for example, you have countries talking about, well, if a weapon can be hidden, that's an aspect, how quickly it can be drawn. Meanwhile, you have something like this, which pretty much was designed in such a way that you couldn't want for anything more in a mid-range bladed weapon, okay? And we'll discuss why that is, all right? So, one of the first things about a weapon is, depending on how you're going to use it, the angle of the blade, the strength of the blade, where the blade is strengthened, etc., okay? For something that's mid-range to a large bladed weapon, you need to have certain things intact. So, for example, we've looked at kukuri before. Kukuri have nice weight to them. They have a shape that gives you certain advantages when you're ambushing somebody, things of that nature. Now, the Hori Hori has a very thick blade and an interesting cutting angle, okay? The thickness of this blade and the stability of it, the strength of it, even though it's not a full tongue construction, is incredibly strong, okay? This thing will not break. Why is that important? When you're fighting with a weapon that's not a small weapon, and a bladed weapon in this case, and you're cutting into somebody, you're going to find that in real situations, your knife can get broken off. You can hit bone, and it can make the knife go off into different directions, can rebound, things of that nature. So, a knife like this, if you look at the sides, one side has a serrated surface blade, the other is straight blade at a, I guess would be like a 27 angle or so. When you cut into the body and you catch a rib, for example, maybe this much of the blade is in the rib, okay? You have to go out of there. These surface areas can cause the type of movement on the surface area you need, and the cutting area to cut through, okay, with gross, strong cuts, so that it gives you the ability to withdraw this weapon even if you don't cut properly. So if I'm really cutting into your ribs, I want to be going at this angle so it goes through. But if I do get caught this way, now I can just simply come up or down, turning the target area, creating a little bit of movement, a little bit of area that can be cut, and I can withdraw my weapon, okay? The weight of this weapon also figures in because you can use it even as a club partially, okay? Even the angle, the convex angle here, if you can see it, there's a slight indentation, actually creates a rebar, a kind of a strength and stability in and of itself. So when you're hitting with this, boom, it has a lot of power, okay? And that means that you can smack something and even break something down with this and then come into a cutting movement, okay? The blade, even though it's maybe not as sharp as other weapons, has enough sharpness that you can just simply use this to cut, okay? And you also have this little strap which allows you, under certain circumstances, if you desire, to retain the weapon in this fashion, okay? So those are all things that make this weapon a very good choice for kind of a mid-length cutting weapon, all right? Also, you see how that point is reinforced, okay? That means that, again, when you're using the point into targets, okay, the weapon will pierce. And not only that, but it's not the sharpness, it's also the weight of the weapon. So when you're going into soft tissue, okay, this will cut into and push aside viscera and other things in the body, okay? It won't get repelled because of its weight, all right? So one of the things that makes this weapon so devastating is that aspect, is that it has enough weight that it can control itself and move through the target mass, all right? Also, whenever you see serrated areas, people don't like them a lot of times, but it's condensing the length of this weapon to a degree so that, in fact, if you were to straighten out the surface area, you'd have a longer weapon, which means you'd have more cutting surface, okay? And that manifests because when you're cutting, each of these individual crevices, okay, represents more surface area that you can cut through. And because of the shape of it, it gives you a little bit of force. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a way to explain this, but when you are here in the middle of one of these areas, okay, you have some space between the next node here and the middle, okay, the next crest, if we look at these as waves, okay? That little space gives you some room to move and create a little bit of force, okay, without any friction, okay, letting you rip through your target area, okay? And you multiply that by each one of these, now you can rip through a lot easier than if you're dealing with a blade that is just simply shaped without any sort of serrated area, okay? So you can hit with this, you have a reinforced tip, okay? The handle is strong enough that you can use the handle. You could take this off and even reinforce this so that you had a very strong area to buttress, okay? And this is an example of a weapon that, you know, you might see this all over the place and people wouldn't even consider it a weapon, all right? However, as you can see, this is actually a very effective weapon for self-protection and for use of force and maximizing multiplying use of force. I want to emphasize that when we talk about bladed weapons, I know it gets a little bit detailed, but it's a science in that respect. And you need to understand these things in order to understand when you're considering different weapons, how to protect yourself against them, how to use them. So it's important that we don't flinch from that, if that makes any sense. Also, it's important to understand the difference between appearance and actual viability, because there's a very strong movement nowadays to have all these very pretty knives that open up really nice and they sound really good and they look really tough. But anytime you have a joint in a knife, like in a folder, that's a point of potential failure in a weapon, okay? And the strength of the blade will determine a lot of what you can use the weapon for. And this gives you much more possibilities. And it's not something that you would use the same way that you'd use a smaller blade for a lot of dexterity. Like something even like a karambit, or just a folder, or just a smaller fixed blade. It's something you would use to actually go in and cause massive body trauma, including attacking the skeletal system and certain areas, bone parts of the human body that are vulnerable. So also understanding what you're targeting with a weapon, along with what weapon you're using, is very important. Also understanding all aspects. I don't have to be lethal with this, okay? You can use this because of the weight of it, okay? Without necessarily killing a person, okay? You could even incorporate this into different aspects, which is a little bit more levels to the game. But if I am also holding something like I like to hang onto these keychains that extend, that are very strong. If I thread that through this, I now have something I can garrote with. And again, I don't have to use that to necessarily suffocate somebody, but it's a control measure, okay? Or even just putting this around and having this as a means. So think in multiple ways about the weapons that you're using. Always remembering that the thing that will determine how you use the weapon is your body training. Okay, not only then will you start to look at the weapon's individual aspects. Always defer to strong whole body movements that you can do under stress and under pressure, working your way to smaller movements that might be more specific for dealing with a weapon. Okay? All right, I hope this was informative. Take care.